Section 6 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Dennison, Portland, Maine. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Section K. Payoffs to Watergate Defendants. Subsection 1. Early Payoff Discussions. As already noted, on June 20 or 21, Liddy met with LaRue and Martian and told them of commitments made to provide bail, legal expenses, and family support funds for the Watergate defendants. Martian said he also discussed Hunt's request to CRP for legal fees with CRP counsel Kenneth Parkinson and Paul O'Brien, and with William Bittman, Hunt's attorney. Martian said he thought this request was blackmail and should not be paid. He said he had no other discussions regarding payment of money to the defendants. Dean, however, testified that Martian suggested that the CIA assist regarding financial support for the defendants. This discussion concerning the CIA, Dean said, arose at a meeting among Dean, Martian, and Mitchell, during which Mitchell suggested that Dean contact Ehrlichman and Haldeman to have the White House request CIA financial assistance for the defendants. Dean did meet with General Walters on June 26, June 27, and June 28, and asked Walters whether the CIA would provide financial assistance for bail, legal defense, and family support. Walters answered in the negative. Subsection 2. The activities of Herbert Kalmbach and Tony Ulasewicz. On June 28, Dean testified he met with Mitchell, LaRue, and Martian and informed them that the CIA would not provide financial assistance. According to Dean, LaRue then indicated that Stans had only limited cash, $70,000 or $80,000, and that much more would be needed. Dean testified that Mitchell asked him to obtain Haldeman's and Ehrlichman's approval to use Herbert Kalmbach to raise the necessary money. Mitchell denied being at this meeting and asked Dean to acquire Kalmbach's services. Dean testified he conveyed the suggestion to Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who told him to contact Kalmbach. During an April 14, 1973 meeting among the President, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman, Haldeman confirmed this fact, stating, quote, "We, Ehrlichman and Haldeman, referred him, Dean, to Kalmbach," unquote. As a result, Dean called Kalmbach on June 28, 1972, and told him that Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell had requested that he come to Washington as quickly as possible. Kalmbach immediately flew to Washington and met with Dean on June 29. Dean knew Kalmbach did not wish to engage in further fundraising. In order to persuade Kalmbach to take this new assignment, Dean said he told Kalmbach all he knew respecting the break-in and suggested that the scandal might involve the president himself, although he did not know this for a fact. He told Kalmbach that Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell felt it very important that he raise the money and instructed Kalmbach to contact LaRue as to the amounts needed and the timing. Kalmbach confirmed that he met with Dean on June 29 and was asked by Dean to assume the fundraising assignment. He said Dean stressed that the assignment required absolute secrecy and indicated that if it became known, it might jeopardize the campaign. Kalmbach said that in giving him this assignment, Dean indicated he spoke for others, not only for himself. He said that although Dean did not use Haldeman's or Ehrlichman's name, he knew Dean reported to Ehrlichman and worked for Haldeman. And since Dean was counsel to the president, Kalmbach believed Dean had authority to ask him to undertake this task. Stans testified he met with Kalmbach on June 29 and gave him $75,000 after being informed that the money was needed for a special White House project. Stans said that Kalmbach stated he was asking for the money on, quote, high authority, unquote. According to both Kalmbach's and Stans' testimony, Kalmbach did not inform Stans how the money would be used. Kalmbach distributed the money through Tony Ulasewicz, who had been hired originally by John Ehrlichman for White House assignments. Ulasewicz was unable to deliver the money to either Douglas Caddy or Paul O'Brien, the first two contacts Kalmbach suggested, because of their reluctance to receive funds under the conditions set by Ulasewicz. The third contact, William Bittman, Hunt's attorney, after an initial rejection, agreed to accept $25,000 in cash in a brown envelope placed on a ledge in a telephone booth in his law office building. Ulasewicz wanted to deliver the full amount received from Stans, $75,000, but Bittman only wanted his initial fee of $25,000. The delivery of these funds was typical of the procedure Ulasewicz used on future occasions. He placed the envelope containing the $25,000 in the telephone booth and called Bittman to retrieve it. Bittman described the color of the suit he was wearing. Ulasewicz hid and watched until Bittman came out of the elevator, went to the booth, took the envelope, and went back into the elevator. Ulasewicz then left the building. After making this delivery to Bittman, Ulasewicz received a call from Kalmbach at another telephone booth. Kalmbach gave Ulasewicz a telephone number and told him to contact the "writer," or the "writer's wife," code names for Hunt and Mrs. Hunt. Ulasewicz, using his alias Mr. Rivers, called Mrs. Hunt. He asked her what sums of money would be needed for the various defendants. Mrs. Hunt gave Ulasewicz figures for a 5-month period that covered salaries for Hunt, McCord, and Liddy, $3,000 a month for each. Family support for Barker, Sturgis, Gonzalez, and Martinez, totaling about $14,000, and a separate $23,000 to Barker, which included, $10,000 bail, $10,000 under the table, and $3,000 for other expenses, Mrs. Hunt also told Ulasewicz what would be required for legal fees. The lawyers for Hunt, McCord, Liddy, and Barker were each to receive $25,000, an additional $10,000 in legal fees for each of the remaining 3 defendants, Sturgis, Gonzalez, and Martinez, was also required. These were only the initial requirements. The total sum Mrs. Hunt was requesting was in the vicinity of $400,000 to $450,000. This, of course, was very much above the $75,000 Ulasewicz had received from Kalmbach. Ulasewicz kept Kalmbach informed, respecting his discussions with Mrs. Hunt. Ulasewicz arranged with Mrs. Hunt the supply of $40,000 as a "down payment." Ulasewicz placed the $40,000 for Mrs. Hunt in a locker at National Airport in Washington and telephoned her instructions to pick up the key to the locker, which would be scotch-taped under the ledge in a telephone booth at the airport. The key was placed exactly 5 minutes before Mrs. Hunt arrived to retrieve it. Again, Ulasewicz assumed a position where he could observe the telephone booth unseen. He saw Mrs. Hunt, whose clothing was known to him, go to the telephone booth, retrieve the key, open the locker, and remove the money. Kalmbach came to Washington on July 19 to meet with Dean and LaRue and receive an additional amount of money from LaRue. According to Kalmbach, the amount was $40,000. LaRue, however, estimated $20,000. This money came from the $81,000 which Sloan and Stans had removed from Stans' safe and given to LaRue. Kalmbach testified that he took the $40,000 to New York and gave it to Ulasewicz. After the July 19 meeting, Kalmbach became concerned over the clandestine nature of the funding operations, which he found distasteful. Dean, at that meeting, had asked Kalmbach to raise additional funds for the Watergate defendants, and Kalmbach had determined to talk to Ehrlichman about it. He wanted Ehrlichman's assurances as to the propriety of the assignment. Until that time, he had distributed funds given him by Stans or LaRue. Now he was being asked to seek an outside contributor. On July 26, Kalmbach traveled to Washington and met with Ehrlichman. He found Ehrlichman familiar with a fundraising assignment he had received from Dean. He explained to Ehrlichman that the secrecy of the operation and the various activities connected with it disturbed him. Kalmbach said he remembered vividly the meeting with Ehrlichman because, "I looked at him and I said, 'John, I am looking right into your eyes. I know Jeannie and your family. You know Barbara and my family. You know that my family and my reputation mean everything to me, and it is just absolutely necessary, John, that you tell me, first, that John Dean has the authority to direct me in this assignment and that I am to go forward on it.'" Kalmbach said Ehrlichman declared, "Herb, John Dean does have the authority. It is proper, and you are to go forward." Ehrlichman also emphasized the need for the secrecy, stating that if the press were to learn of these activities, quote, "they would have our heads in their laps," unquote. This satisfied Kalmbach. He left the meeting and later obtained an additional $30,000 from LaRue, which he transmitted to Ulasewicz. Ehrlichman denied that he reassured Kalmbach, but did recall a conversation where secrecy was discussed and that Kalmbach told him, quote, "Mr. Ulasewicz was carrying money back and forth," unquote. Kalmbach said he returned to California and raised an additional $75,000 in cash from a private contributor, Thomas V. Jones, chairman of Northrop Corporation. Mr. Jones did not know the intended use of the money and apparently believed he was making a campaign contribution to the president. Kalmbach notified Ulasewicz to come to California and meet him in front of the Airporter Inn near Kalmbach's office in Newport Beach. Kalmbach picked Ulasewicz up in his car. They drove a distance, parked, and Kalmbach gave the cash to Ulasewicz. Ulasewicz told the committee that while in California, he warned Kalmbach that, quote, "something here is not kosher," unquote. That, quote, "it's definitely not your ballgame, Mr. Kalmbach," unquote. He told Kalmbach that because of the increasing size of the money demands and other surrounding circumstances, it was time for both of them to get out of the project. Kalmbach testified that in mid-August, Dean and LaRue contacted him again seeking additional funds. He decided, however, that he would not participate further in this assignment. Kalmbach told the committee that one factor that disturbed him and led him to quit was the newspaper stories about Watergate appearing in the press. On September 19, at LaRue's urgent request, Ulasewicz flew to Washington from New York and delivered the remaining funds Kalmbach had given him, $53,000 to Mrs. Hunt, $29,000 to LaRue. This terminated Ulasewicz's and Kalmbach's activities respecting the funding of the Watergate defendants. Kalmbach testified that after these funds were delivered by Ulasewicz to Mrs. Hunt and LaRue, he arranged a meeting with Dean and LaRue in Dean's office to reconcile with LaRue the amount of money distributed in the operation. He testified that the total amount received by him and dispersed through Ulasewicz was approximately $220,000. As soon as he had made the reconciliation with LaRue, Kalmbach destroyed his notes by shredding and burning them in Dean's office. LaRue took over the raising of funds and their distribution to the Watergate defendants. His contact became William Bittman, Hunt's attorney. However, because of the rising demands for money, it was soon necessary for LaRue to find additional funds. Subsection 3. The Hunt to Colson telephone call. In late November 1972, Hunt called Colson to complain about the failure of the White House and CRP to meet their monetary commitments. Colson recorded the conversation, and a copy of its transcript is entered in the record as Exhibit Number 152. In this call, Hunt, among other things, stated, "There is a great deal of unease and concern on the part of 7 defendants. But there is a great deal of financial expense that has not been covered, and what we have been getting has been coming in very minor jibs and drabs, and Parkinson, who has been the go-between with my attorney, doesn't seem to be very effective, and we are now reaching a point of which these people have really got to. This is a long-haul thing, and the stakes are very high, and I thought that you would want to know that this thing must not break apart for foolish reasons. All right, now we've set a deadline now for a close of business on the 25th of November for the resolution on the liquidation of everything that is outstanding. We are protecting guys who are really responsible, but now that's that. And of course, that's a continuing requirement. But at the same time, this is a two-way street. And as I said before, we think that now is the time when a move should be made, and surely the cheapest commodity available is money. These lawyers have not been paid. There are large sums of money outstanding. That's the principal thing. Living allowances which are due again on the 31st of this month. We want that stuff well in hand for some months in advance. I think these are all reasonable requests. They're all promised in advance and reaffirmed from time to my attorney and so forth. So in turn, I've been giving commitments to the people who look to me. Colson gave a copy of the tape recording to Dean. On November 15, Dean, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman met at Camp David to discuss the conversation and the increasing, threatening demands transmitted through Hunt's lawyer to Paul O'Brien. Dean testified that his instructions from Haldeman and Ehrlichman were to meet with Mitchell, play the tape, and tell him to take care of these problems. Dean went to New York, played the tape for Mitchell, but received no indication from Mitchell that he would take any action. Subsection 4. The $350,000 White House Fund. Prior to April 7, 1972, $350,000 in cash previously kept in Sloan's safe at CRP had been sent to the White House at Haldeman's request, purportedly for polling purposes. Strachan had received the money in Sloan's office and had taken it to the White House. Haldeman had arranged for a person he trusted, not identified with the White House, to keep the funds in a private bank account. According to Dean's testimony, in the first week of December, Mitchell called Dean and told him that a portion of this $350,000 must be used to meet the demands by Hunt and others. Mitchell indicated that the money used would be later replaced. Mitchell asked Dean to obtain Haldeman's approval for this action. Dean conveyed Mitchell's message to Haldeman. Although both Dean and Haldeman were reluctant to use this money, they had no alternative. Haldeman authorized Dean to inform Strachan to deliver the money to CRP. Strachan testified that, at first, he delivered only $40,000 of the $350,000 to LaRue. Haldeman confirmed this delivery when, in an April 14, 1973 meeting with the president, he stated, quote, "Then they got desperate for money, and being desperate for money took back, I think that it was $40,000, unquote. But this delivery, Dean testified, did not satisfy the demands that, quote, continued to be relayed by Mr. Bittman to Mr. O'Brien, who, in turn, would relay them to Mr. Mitchell, Mr. LaRue, and myself. I, in turn, would tell Haldeman and Ehrlichman of the demands, unquote." Dean testified that the demands reached the crescendo point shortly before the trial in early January. He said that O'Brien and LaRue came to his office and told him of the seriousness of the problem. Also, he said, Mitchell called him to instruct that once again he should ask Haldeman for the necessary funds. Dean said he called Haldeman, told him of Mitchell's request, and recommended that they deliver the entire balance of the $350,000 to LaRue. Haldeman acquiesced, according to Dean, and said, quote, "Send the entire damn bundle to them, but make sure we get a receipt for $350,000, unquote. Dean testified he called Strachan and told him to take the money to LaRue. In a meeting on April 14, 1973, Haldeman told the president that he had given the balance of the $350,000 to LaRue because, quote, "They needed money, and we wanted to get rid of money. It seemed it was of mutual interest in working it out." Unquote. In an April 16, 1973 meeting, Haldeman told the President that his participation in payments to the defendants, in my viewpoint, wasn't to shut them up, but that is a hard case for anybody to believe, I suppose." Unquote. Subsection 5. Additional pressures by Hunt. Severe pressure from Hunt for additional funds came after the Watergate trial and prior to his sentence. Hunt testified that he requested his attorney, Mr. Bittman, to arrange a meeting between Hunt and O'Brien. Hunt told O'Brien when they met that his legal fees amounted to approximately $60,000 and that he was also concerned about the future of his family and desired to have the equivalent of 2 years' subsistence available to them before his incarceration. Although Hunt testified he did not intend any threat, he told the committee, "And I put it to Mr. O'Brien that I had engaged, as he might or might not know, in other activities, which I believed I described as seamy activities for the White House. I do not believe that I specified them. However, I did make reference to them. The context of such references was that if anyone was to receive benefits at that time, in view of my long and loyal service, if not hazardous service, for the White House, that certainly I should receive priority consideration." Hunt said O'Brien suggested that he send a memorandum to Colson. Hunt did not want to write a memorandum but thought he should contact Colson to explain his situation to him. Bittman contacted Colson's office and arranged for Colson's law partner, David Shapiro, to meet him on February 16, 1973. Hunt testified he told Shapiro substantially the same things he told O'Brien, including a reference to his, quote, "seamy activities," unquote, for the White House. Hunt was very disappointed with the meeting since Shapiro did not appear sympathetic. Hunt said he made it clear to Shapiro that he wanted the money prior to the date of his sentence so he could make, quote, "prudent distribution of that among the members of my family, my dependents, taking care of insurance premiums and that sort of thing, that it would have to be delivered to me before I was in jail," unquote. Hunt testified that on March 20 or 21, just prior to his sentence, he received $75,000 in cash. LaRue admitted making the payment to Hunt after approval from Mitchell. Subsection 6. The March 21 meeting in the Oval Office. The indictment returned against Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Colson, Mitchell, Strachan, Mardian, and Parkinson alleges that the final payment to Hunt by LaRue was made on March 21, 1973, not March 20. Shortly after Dean, Haldeman, and the President discussed Hunt's demands for money. According to the edited presidential transcripts, it now appears that the conversation Dean testified he had with the President on March 13, 1973, concerning Hunt's demand actually occurred on the morning of March 21, although in his testimony before the committee, Dean insisted that he correctly placed this conversation on March 13. In this conversation, Dean said he told the President, quote, that there were money demands being made by the 7 convicted defendants and that the sentencing of these individuals was not far off. It was during this conversation that Haldeman came into the office. After this brief interruption by Haldeman's coming in, but while he was still there, I told the President about the fact that there was no money to pay these individuals to meet their demands. He asked me how much it would cost. I told him that I could only make an estimate that it might be as high as $1 million or more. He told me that that was no problem, and he also looked over at Haldeman and repeated the same statement. He then asked me who was demanding the money, and I told him it was principally coming from Hunt through his attorney. The conversation then turned back to the question from the President regarding the money that was being paid to the defendants. He asked me how this was done. I told him I didn't know much about it, other than the fact that the money was laundered so it could not be traced, and then there were secret deliveries. I told him I was learning about things I had never known before, but the next time I would certainly be more knowledgeable." Unquote. Dean also testified that money matters were discussed during his morning meeting with the president on March 21. The edited transcript of the March 21 meeting demonstrates that Dean's recollection as set forth in his testimony of his principal meeting with the president concerning the hush money demands from the Watergate defendants was in a large part accurate. The following portions of the edited transcript supplied by the president are particularly illustrative. Dean: So that is it. That is the extent of the knowledge. So where are the soft spots on this? Well, first of all, there is the problem of the continued blackmail, which will not only go on now, but it will go on while these people are in prison, and it will compound the obstruction of justice situation. It will cost money. It is dangerous. People around here are not pros at this sort of thing. This is the sort of thing mafia people can do, washing money, getting clean money, and things like that. We just don't know about those things because we are not criminals and not used to dealing in that business. President: That's right. Dean: It is a tough thing to know how to do. President: Maybe it takes a gang to do that. Dean: That's right. There is a real problem as to whether we could even do it. Plus, there is a real problem in raising money. Mitchell has been working on raising some money. He's one of the ones with the most to lose. But there is no denying the fact that the White House, in Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Dean, are involved in some of the early money decisions. President: How much money do you need? Dean: I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next 2 years. President: We could get that. On the money. If you need the money, you could get that. You could get $1 million. You could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. It is not easy, but it could be done. But the question is, who the hell would handle it? Any ideas on that? Dean: That's right. Well, I think that is something that Mitchell ought to be charged with. President: I would think so too. What do you think? You don't need $1 million right away, but you need $1 million. Is that right? Dean: That is right. President: You need it in cash, don't you? I am just thinking out loud here for a moment. Would you put that through the Cuban committee? Dean: No. President: It is going to be checks, cash, money, etc. How if that ever comes out? Are you going to handle it? Is the Cuban committee an obstruction of justice if they want to help? Dean: Well, they have priests in it. President: Would that give a little bit of a cover? Dean: That would give some for the Cubans and possibly Hunt. Then you've got Liddy. McCord is not accepting any money, so he's not a bought man right now. President: Okay, go ahead. President: Just looking at the immediate problem, don't you think you have to handle Hunt's financial situation damn soon? Dean: I think that is... I talked to Mitchell about that last night and, President: It seems to me we have to keep the cap on the bottle that much, or we don't have any options. Dean: That's right. President: Either that or it all blows right now. Talking about your obstruction of justice, though, I don't see it. Dean: Well, I have been a conduit for information on taking care of people out there who are guilty of crimes. President: Oh, you mean like the blackmailers? Dean: The blackmailers, right. President: Well, I wonder if that part of it can't be... I wonder if that doesn't... Let me put it frankly. I wonder if that doesn't have to be continued. Let me put it this way. Let us suppose that you get the $1 million and you get the proper way to handle it. You could hold that side? Dean: Uh-huh. President: It would seem to me that would be worthwhile. Another way to do it then, Bob, and John realizes this, is to continue to try to cut our losses. Now we have to take a look at that course of action. First, it is going to require approximately $1 million to take care of the jackasses who are in jail. That could be arranged. But you realize that after we are gone, and assuming we can expend this money, then they are going to crack and it would be an unseemly story. Frankly, all the people aren't going to care that much. Dean: They're going to stonewall it as it now stands, excepting Hunt. That's why his threat. Haldeman: It's Hunt's opportunity. President: That's why for your immediate things you have no choice but to come up with the $120,000 or whatever it is, right? Dean: That's right. President: Would you agree that that's the prime thing, that you damn well better get that done? Dean: Obviously, he ought to be given some signal anyway. President: Expletive deleted. Get it. In a way that, who is going to talk to him? Coulson? He is the one who is supposed to know him. At this meeting and at the afternoon meeting on March 21, other alternatives to paying hush money were considered, including certain public disclosures. During the afternoon meeting, with regard to public disclosures, the participants perceived no viable, quote, option, unquote, which would not precipitate revelation of the cover-up. At the close of the afternoon March 21 meeting, the president, telling Dean, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman he had to leave, concluded with an unanswered question. President: What the hell does one disclose that isn't going to blow something? Subsection 7. Other relevant presidential meetings concerning payoffs. The following morning, on March 22, 1973, Dean met with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell in Haldeman's office. At the beginning of this meeting, Dean said Ehrlichman asked Mitchell whether Hunt's money problem had been resolved. Dean said Mitchell replied he didn't think it was a problem. Mitchell denied this discussion took place. Ehrlichman recalls a conversation on March 22 when Dean, not Ehrlichman, asked Mitchell, without specific reference to Hunt, quote, "Is that matter taken care of?" unquote. Mitchell's answer, Ehrlichman says, was something like, quote, "I guess so," unquote. Dean's version is supported by the edited presidential transcripts. The transcripts show that in a meeting between the president and Dean in the Oval Office on April 16, 1973, Dean recalled that a few days after the March 21 meeting, he met with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell. Dean said Ehrlichman asked him, quote, "Well, is that problem with Hunt straightened out?" unquote. Dean said he told Ehrlichman to ask Mitchell, who in turn replied, quote, "I think the problem is solved," unquote. The conversation between the president and Dean continued. President: That's all? Dean: That's all he said. President: In other words, that was done at the Mitchell level. Dean: That's right. President: But you had knowledge. Haldeman had knowledge. Ehrlichman had knowledge. And I suppose I did that night. That assumes culpability on that, doesn't it? Also relevant is an April 17, 1973 conversation among the president, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. President: Well, inaudible. I suppose then we should have shut it off. 'Cause later on you met in your office and Mitchell said that was taken care of. Haldeman: The next day. Maybe I can find the date by that. President: Yeah, and Dean was there and said, what about this money for Hunt? Wasn't Dean there? Haldeman: No, what happened was Ehrlichman and Dean and Mitchell and I were in the office, in my office, and we were discussing other matters, and in the process of it, Mitchell said, he turned to Dean and said, "Let me raise another point. Have you taken care of the other problem? The Hunt problem?" But we all knew instantly what he meant. Dean kind of looked a little flustered and said, well, no, I don't know where that is," or something. And Mitchell said, "Well, I guess it's taken care of," and so we assumed from that Mitchell had taken care of it, and there was no further squeak out of it. So I now assume that Mitchell took care of it. Just prior to the above exchange, the president recalled his discussion with Dean on March 21 about the possibility that it might require $1 million to meet the blackmail demands from Watergate defendants. Haldeman, inaccurately, recalled to the president that he, the president, had told Dean, quote, "Once you start down the path with blackmail, it's constant escalation," unquote. Then Haldeman said, quote, "They could jump and then say, yes, well, that was morally wrong. What you should have said is that blackmail is wrong, not that it's too costly," unquote. At the same meeting, the following colloquy took place between the president and Haldeman. Haldeman: "We left it, that we can't do anything about it anyway. We don't have any money, and it isn't a question to be directed here. This is something relates to Mitchell's problem. Ehrlichman has no problem with this thing, with Hunt." And Ehrlichman said, expletive removed, Quote, "If you're going to get into blackmail, to hell with it," unquote. President: Good, unintelligible. Thank God you were in there when it happened. But you remember the conversation? Haldeman: Yes, sir. President: I didn't tell him to go get the money, did I? Haldeman: No. Some of the participants involved in the payments to defendants, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Kalmbach, told the committee that payments were authorized not to buy the silence of the defendants, but solely to create a defense fund for the Watergate burglars, a fund which they said they believed was legitimate. And in April 14, 1973 meeting between the President and Haldeman, the following colloquy took place. Haldeman: That was the line they used around here, that we've got to have money for their legal fees and family. President: Support. Well, I heard something about that at a much later time. President: And frankly, not knowing much about obstruction of justice, I thought it was perfectly proper. Would it be perfectly proper? Ehrlichman: The defense of the President: Barragans? Ehrlichman: The Chicago 7. President: The Chicago 7? Haldeman: They have a defense fund for everybody. This evidence must be considered in light of the contrary evidence presented above. As indicated, none of those who authorized or participated in the making of the payments to the Watergate defendants used their own money. To the contrary, they used campaign funds contributed by others who had no knowledge that their money was being employed to pay the legal fees of the Watergate defendants and to support their families. Also relevant is the clandestine nature of the payoffs, which were made with $100 bills and placed in, quote, drops, unquote, by an unseen intermediary using a code name. Even the President recognized that the payoffs smacked of cover-up. In an April 27 meeting with Henry Peterson, the secret payments of money to the Watergate defendants were discussed. Henry Peterson: Once you do it in a clandestine fashion, it takes on the elements. President: Elements of a cover-up. Henry Peterson: That's right, and obstruction of justice. End of section 6. Section 7 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Dennison, Portland, Maine. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Section L. Representations concerning executive clemency. Only the President of the United States can grant executive clemency in a manner involving a federal crime. The evidence reveals that during the latter part of 1972 and in early January 1973, prior to the first Watergate trial, promises of executive clemency were made to certain Watergate defendants in a further effort to maintain their silence. These promises of executive clemency were made with the representation that they were authorized by high officials close to the President. Ehrlichman testified that he discussed executive clemency with the President as early as July 1972. According to Ehrlichman, the President did not even want members of the White House staff to discuss clemency with anyone involved in the case, much less to offer it. The President, in a statement on August 15, 1973, confirmed Ehrlichman's statement that he told Ehrlichman in July that under no circumstances could executive clemency be considered for participants in the Watergate affair. Subsection 1. Representations to James McCord. McCord testified that in late September or early October 1972, Gerald Alch, his attorney, met with William Bittman, who represented Hunt. After this meeting, McCord said, Alch told McCord that executive clemency, financial support, and rehabilitation would be made available to the Watergate defendants. Alch denied in his testimony before the committee that he transmitted these assurances of executive clemency to McCord. To the contrary, he testified, he told McCord, Jim, it can be Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving all rolled into one, but in my opinion, the President would not touch this with a 10-foot pole. So, do not rely on any prospect of executive clemency. McCord testified Hunt also told him that executive clemency would be granted and, quote, spoke in terms as though it had already been committed, unquote. Mr. McCord said these assurances from Hunt were made in late September or October while Hunt and McCord were at the courthouse. McCord stated that discussions involving executive clemency also occurred with Hunt's wife and that from September to December, Mrs. Hunt pressured McCord to remain silent and accept the proposal for executive clemency, which he declined. McCord was told that similar proposals were made to Barker, Gonzalez, Martinez, Sturgis, and Liddy. More direct promises of executive clemency came to McCord after he sent an anonymous letter on December 31 to Jack Caulfield, which dramatically warned that, quote, if Helms goes and if the Watergate operation is laid at the CIA's feet where it does not belong, every tree in the forest will fall. It will be a scorched desert. The whole matter is at the precipice now. Just pass the message that if they want it to blow, they are on exactly the right course. I'm sorry that you will get hurt in the fallout, unquote. McCord had become increasingly alarmed over what he considered efforts by his attorney and persons at CRP and the White House to have him falsely assert, as a defense to the criminal charges against him, that the break-in was part of a CIA mission. Caulfield, who believed the letter came from McCord, immediately telephoned its contents to Dean's assistant, Fred Fielding, and later gave the letter to Dean. Dean discussed the problem with Paul O'Brien. O'Brien reported the matter to Mitchell, who directed O'Brien to have Caulfield determine McCord's intentions. On January 8, 1973, Dean asked O'Brien to communicate to McCord's lawyer that a friend of McCord's would contact McCord, which O'Brien did. O'Brien also told Hunt's lawyer, Bittman, about the conversation with Dean. Later that day, McCord and Alch visited Bittman's office, and after Alch met with Bittman alone, Alch told McCord that he would receive a call that evening from a White House, quote, friend, unquote. The initial contact with McCord was made by Caulfield through Tony Ulasewicz, who telephoned McCord in the early morning hours of January 9, 1973, and told him to go to a nearby phone booth to receive a message. McCord complied and heard a voice, unfamiliar to him, say, quote, plead guilty. 1 year is a long time. You will get executive clemency. Your family will be taken care of, and when you get out, you will be rehabilitated and a job will be found for you. Don't take immunity when called before the grand jury. After delivering the message, Ulasewicz reported McCord's apparent satisfaction to Caulfield. In the meantime, according to Dean, O'Brien and Mitchell both contacted Dean and told him that since Hunt had received an assurance of executive clemency, discussed below, McCord and the others were similarly entitled. Mitchell and O'Brien felt Caulfield could most effectively carry that message to McCord. Dean testified that he called Caulfield, told him to see McCord in person, and gave him a clemency message for McCord similar to the one transmitted to Hunt through Bittman. Mitchell's testimony before the committee indicated he knew in January 1973 that Dean asked Caulfield to talk to McCord to ascertain McCord's plans, but Mitchell does not remember contemporaneously learning that Caulfield had offered McCord clemency. Caulfield arranged a meeting with McCord on the George Washington Parkway in Virginia, the first of several, through another telephone call from Ulasewicz to McCord at the telephone booth near McCord's home. This meeting took place on January 12. McCord testified that Caulfield then urged him to plead guilty, receive clemency, and be rehabilitated afterward. According to McCord, Caulfield said that he carried the clemency message, quote, from the very highest levels of the White House, unquote. McCord said he was told by Caulfield that the president would be apprised at the next meeting and that Caulfield said, quote, I may have a message to you at our next meeting from the president himself, unquote. Caulfield testified that on January 13, Dean advised him to stress to McCord the sincerity of the clemency offer. When Caulfield asked if the offer came from the president, Dean replied it came, quote, "from the top," unquote. Caulfield said that he assumed this implied Ehrlichman speaking for the president, because Dean rarely made decisions without Ehrlichman's input. Caulfield, however, never had personal discussions with the president on this matter and had no personal knowledge that the president authorized a clemency offer to McCord. On January 14, Caulfield again met with McCord on the George Washington Parkway and told McCord that his efforts to develop, as a defense to the criminal charges against him, his claims of government wiretaps of certain phone calls he had made to foreign embassies would not be successful. McCord became very concerned and was assured that he would receive clemency after 10 or 11 months' imprisonment. Caulfield on this occasion told McCord, "The president's ability to govern is at stake. Another Teapot Dome scandal is possible, and the government may fall. Everybody else is on track but you. You are not following the game plan. Get closer to your attorney." There followed 2 telephone conversations on January 15 and January 16, during which McCord indicated to Caulfield that he had no desire to talk to him further and suggested that if the White House wanted to be honest, it should look into McCord's perjury charges against Magruder and his claims as to the tapping of his 2 embassy calls. However, a final meeting was arranged between McCord and Caulfield on the George Washington Parkway for January 25. McCord testified that at this meeting, Caulfield repeated the offers of clemency, financial support, and rehabilitation. According to McCord, Caulfield discouraged his hopes for White House action on his wiretap defense and cautioned him that if he made public allegations against high administration officials, the administration would undoubtedly defend itself. McCord interpreted this as a, quote, "personal threat," unquote, to his safety, but stated his willingness to take the risk. Caulfield testified that in this final meeting he concluded that McCord was definitely going to speak out on the Watergate burglary and would probably make allegations against White House and other high officials. Caulfield said he told McCord, "Jim, I have worked with these people and I know them to be as tough-minded as you and I. When you make your statement, don't underestimate them. If I were in your shoes, I would probably be doing the same thing." Subsection 2. Representations to Howard Hunt. On December 8, 1972, Hunt's wife, Dorothy, died in an airplane crash in Chicago. 3 weeks later, on December 31, Hunt sent a letter to Colson that stated, "I had understood you to say that you would be willing to see my attorney, Bill Bittman, at any time. After my wife's death, I asked him to see you, but his efforts were unavailing. And though I believe I understand the delicacy of your overt position, I nevertheless feel myself even more isolated than before. My wife's death, the imminent trial, my present mental depression, and my inability to get any relief from my friends on whom I had in good faith relied. I can't tell you how important it is under the circumstances for Bill Bittman to have the opportunity to meet with you, and I trust that you will do me that favor. There is a limit to the endurance of any man trapped in a hostile situation, and mine was reached on December 8. I do believe in God, not necessarily a just God, but in governance of a divine being. His will, however, is often enacted through human hands, and human adversaries are arraigned against me." Colson sent Dean a copy of the letter with a note that asked, "Now, what the hell do I do?" Dean testified that on January 2, 1973, Paul O'Brien called him and with some urgency requested that Dean meet with him concerning serious problems with Hunt. When Dean met with O'Brien that evening, O'Brien told Dean that Hunt wished to plead guilty, but before changing his plea, Hunt wanted White House assurance of executive clemency. On January 3, Colson called Dean to say that he did not want to meet with Bittman. Dean testified he went to Ehrlichman and told him the situation. Ehrlichman, according to Dean, asked Colson to meet with Bittman, which Colson did. After meeting with Bittman that same day, Colson met with Dean and Ehrlichman in Ehrlichman's office. Dean testified that Colson was upset and said it was imperative to offer Hunt executive clemency. Dean said Ehrlichman indicated he would speak to the president about it and directed Colson not to address the president on the subject. Ehrlichman testified that at this meeting he told Dean and Colson of his July 1972 conversation with the president, where the president had stressed that no one in the White House was to discuss or offer clemency. The next day, according to Dean, Ehrlichman confided to Dean that he had given Colson an affirmative answer regarding clemency for Hunt, and that Colson had again met with Bittman. On January 5, Colson reported his second meeting with Bittman to Ehrlichman and Dean. Colson said he gave Bittman a general assurance respecting clemency rather than a firm commitment, saying that although a year is a long time, clemency usually comes around Christmas. Dean said he expressed the feeling that the other defendants would expect the same type of arrangement and that Ehrlichman said the same assurance would apply to all. According to Dean, Colson after the meeting told Dean he had ignored Ehrlichman's instructions and discussed clemency with the president. Ehrlichman confirms that in January he met with Colson and Dean to discuss the Hunt-Bittman request for help. Ehrlichman said the main purpose of the meeting was to attempt to deal with Hunt's depressed state of mind and to determine how best to aid him. But, Ehrlichman testified, he made it clear to Colson that under no circumstances could executive clemency be offered Hunt. His version of the January 5 meeting was that Colson gave Dean and Ehrlichman, quote, the strongest kinds of assurances that he had not made any sort of commitment, unquote. However, Hunt did change his plea to guilty at the opening of the trial on January 10. The edited presidential transcripts reveal that the following comments and recollections regarding clemency to Hunt were made at the March 21, 1973 meeting among the president, Haldeman, and Dean before Hunt was sentenced. Dean: Here's what is happening right now, what sort of brings matters to the unintelligible. 1. This is going to be a continual blackmail operation by Hunt and Liddy and the Cubans. No doubt about it. And McCord, who is another one involved. McCord has asked for nothing. McCord did ask to meet with somebody, with Jack Caulfield, who is his old friend, who had gotten him hired over there. And when Caulfield had him hired, he was a perfectly legitimate security man, and he wanted to talk about commutation and things like that. And as you know, Colson has talked indirectly to Hunt about commutation. All of these things are bad, in that they are problems. They are promises. They are commitments. They are the very sort of thing that the Senate is going to be looking most for. I don't think they can find them, frankly. President: Pretty hard. Dean: Pretty hard. Damn hard. It's all cash. President: Pretty hard, I mean, as far as the witnesses are concerned. As a matter of fact, there was a discussion with somebody about Hunt's problem on account of his wife, and I said, of course commutation could be considered on the basis of his wife's death, and that is the only conversation I ever had in that light. Dean: Right. President: You have the problem with Hunt and his clemency. Dean: That's right, and you're going to have a clemency problem with the others. They all are going to expect to be out, and that may put you in a position that is just untenable at some point. You know, the Watergate hearing's just over. Hunt now demanding clemency, or he is going to blow. And politically, it's impossible for you to do it. You know, after everybody. President: That's right. Dean: I am not sure that you will ever be able to deliver on the clemency. It may be just too hot. President: You can't do it politically until after the '74 elections, that's for sure. Your point is that even then you couldn't do it. Dean: That's right. It may further involve you in a way you should not be involved in this. President: No, it is wrong. That's for sure. And the second thing is, we are not going to be able to deliver on any of a clemency thing. You know, Coulson has gone around on this clemency thing with Hunt and the rest. Dean: Hunt is now talking about being out by Christmas. Haldeman: This year? Dean: This year. He was told by O'Brien, who is my conveyor of doom back and forth, that hell, he would be lucky if he were out a year from now, or after Irvin's hearings were over. He said, how in the Lord's name could you be commuted that quickly? He said, well, that is my commitment from Coulson. Haldeman: By Christmas of this year? Dean: Yeah. Haldeman: See, that is verbal evil. Coulson that is your fatal flaw in Chuck. He is an operator in expediency, and he will pay at the time and where he is to accomplish whatever he is there to do. And that's, I would believe that he has made that commitment if Hunt says he has. I would believe he is capable of saying that. President: The only thing we could do with him would be to parole him like the unintelligible situation. But you couldn't buy clemency. Another relevant discussion occurred on April 14, 1973, when the President met with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. In a discussion of the possibility of executive clemency, the President said, It's a shame. There could be clemency in this case, and at the proper time, having in mind the extraordinary sentences of Magruder, etc., etc. But you know damn well it is ridiculous to talk about clemency. They all knew that. Coulson knew that. I mean, when you, Ehrlichman, talked to Coulson and he talked to me. Dean met again with the President on April 15, 1973. By this time, Dean had retained counsel, gone to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and begun to give information about the cover-up. Dean testified he was somewhat shaken when he went to the meeting because he was acting to end the cover-up and knew there would be serious problems for the President. Dean said the most interesting event of the meeting came near the very end. He said the President, quote, got up out of his chair, went behind his chair to the corner of the Executive Office Building office, and in a nearly inaudible tone said to me he was probably foolish to have discussed Hunt's clemency with Coulson, unquote. It was this conduct that led Dean to believe that this conversation was taped. As the committee learned later, there was, indeed, a taping system in operation. However, the President has informed the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia that, unknown to the President at the time, the recorder's tape had, quote, run out, unquote, just prior to the President's meeting with Dean, and that the meeting was thus not recorded. Subsequently, in an April 16, 1973 meeting, the President and Dean again discussed the subject of executive clemency for Hunt. Dean: All the obstruction is technical stuff that mounts up. President: Well, you take for example the clemency bit. That is solely Mitchell apparently, and Coulson's talk with Bittman, where he says he will do everything I can because as a friend. Dean: No, that was with Ehrlichman. President: Hunt? Dean: That was with Ehrlichman. President: Ehrlichman with whom? Dean: Ehrlichman and Coulson and I sat up there. Coulson presented his story to Ehrlichman regarding it, and then John gave Chuck very clear instructions on going back and telling him, quote, give him the inference he's got clemency, but don't give him any commitment. President: No commitment. Dean: Right. President: That's all right. No commitment. I have a right to say here. Take a fellow like Hunt or a Cuban whose wife is sick or something and give them clemency for that purpose. Isn't that right? Dean: That's right. President: But John specifically said no commitment, did he? Dean: Yes. President: And then Coulson went on apparently to Dean: I don't know how Coulson delivered it. President: To Hunt's lawyer. Isn't that your understanding? Dean: Yes, but I don't know what he did or how. President: Where did this business of the Christmas thing get out? John? What in the hell is that all about? That must have been Mitchell, huh? Dean. Nope, that was Chuck again. President. That they would all be out by Christmas? Dean. No, I think he said something to the effect that Christmas is the time the clemency generally occurs. President. Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think that is going to hurt him, do you? Dean. No. President. Clemency is one thing. He is a friend of Hunt's. I'm just trying to put the best face on it. But if it is the wrong thing to do, I have to know. Subsection 3. Representations to Jeb Magruder. Dean testified that on August 16, 1972, Magruder, concerned over his upcoming grand jury appearance, asked him, quote, "What happens if this whole thing comes tumbling down? Will I get executive clemency? And will my family be taken care of?" Unquote. Dean told Magruder that, quote, "I am sure you will," unquote. But Magruder did not consider that statement to be a firm offer of executive clemency. On March 23, 1973, Chief Judge Sirica read aloud the sealed letter received from McCord. As noted, the letter charged that pressure had been exerted on the defendants to plead guilty and remain silent, that perjury had been committed during the Watergate trial, and that others than those adjudged guilty had participated in the Watergate operation. McCord indicated his desire to meet with Judge Sirica and elaborate further on his assertions. He stated that he lacked confidence in the FBI, the Department of Justice, and other such, quote, government representatives, unquote, and thus did not want to present his information to them. McCord, however, was willing to speak to representatives of the Select Committee. McCord's letter caused Magruder concern regarding his previous testimony. On March 25, Magruder presented his situation to CRP lawyers, and they advised him to retain counsel. Magruder testified that the lawyers apparently transmitted his concern to Mitchell because, on March 27, Mitchell phoned Magruder and asked Magruder to meet with him in New York. Magruder flew there that day and told Mitchell his worries, as Magruder recalled it. Mitchell assured him, quote, he would take care of things, that everything would be taken care of, unquote. According to Magruder, quote, everything, unquote, included a guaranteed salary and executive clemency. Mitchell confirmed the meeting with Magruder, as well as Magruder's discussion of the potential perjury charge against him. While Mitchell recalled offering to help Magruder, quote, in any conceivable way, unquote, he denied promising clemency. Mitchell also testified that, in their March 27 meeting, Magruder requested further assurance from someone still in the White House, and Mitchell suggested a meeting with Haldeman. Magruder testified that in January, when he became concerned he might be made a scapegoat, he went to Haldeman and said, quote, I just want you to know that this whole Watergate situation and other activities was a concerted effort by a number of people, and so I went through a literal monologue on what had occurred, unquote. However, Haldeman testified, quote, at no meeting with Magruder did he raise with me a monologue as he has described, unquote. Dean testified that on March 28, Haldeman called him at Camp David and asked him to return to Washington to meet with Mitchell and Magruder. Although Dean resisted, Haldeman persuaded him to participate. Dean said his meeting with Haldeman, Mitchell, and Magruder concerned how Dean planned to testify, if called before an appropriate body, regarding the January 27 and February 4, 1972 meetings in Mitchell's office. Dean said he would not agree to help support the perjured testimony already given by Magruder in this regard. Mitchell testified that at the meeting, Haldeman offered to help Magruder as a friend, but made no other commitments. Magruder recalled that Haldeman was careful to articulate that he, quote, could make no commitments for the president, unquote. Because of Dean's stand and the advice of CRP lawyers, Magruder decided to retain personal counsel. The transcript of an April 14, 1973 meeting among the President, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman indicates the President's view as to how an inference of executive clemency could be given to Magruder in return for his claiming ultimate responsibility, along with Mitchell, for the Watergate affair. President: I would also, though, I'd put a couple of things in and say, Jeb, let me just start here by telling you the President holds great affection for you and your family. I was just thinking last night, this poor kid. Haldeman: Yeah, beautiful kids. President: Lovely wife, and all the rest. It just breaks your heart. And say this is a very painful message for me to bring. I've been asked to give you, but I must do it, and it is that. Put it right out that way. Also, I would put that in so he knows I have personal affection. That's the way the so-called clemency's got to be handled. Do you see, John? Ehrlichman: I understand. Haldeman: Do the same thing with Mitchell. Subsection 4. Representations to G. Gordon Liddy. The edited presidential transcripts contain a reference to a purported promise by Mitchell of a pardon or clemency to Liddy. The following passage is from the April 14, 1972 meeting among the President, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. President: He's not talking because he thinks the President doesn't want him to talk. Is that the point? Ehrlichman: According to them, Mitchell's given him a promise of a pardon. President: Bittman? Ehrlichman: According to Colson and Shapiro. President: I don't know where they get that. Mitchell has promised Liddy a pardon? Ehrlichman: Yes, sir. On pages 485 through 87, the following colloquy from the same meeting appears. President: Colson to Bittman: I guess that's the only thing we have on that, except Mitchell apparently had said something about clemency to people. Haldeman: To Liddy. President: And Mitchell has has he ever discussed clemency with you? Ehrlichman: No. President: Has he ever discussed it with you? Haldeman: Nope. President: Unintelligible. We were all here in the room. Haldeman: Well, may have said, look, we've got to take care of this. President: But he's never said, look, you're going to get a pardon from these people when this is over. Never used any such language around here, has he, John? Ehrlichman: Not to me. Haldeman: I don't think so. President: With Dean, has he? Ehrlichman: Well, I don't know. That's a question I can't answer. President: Well, but Dean's never raised it. In fact, Dean told me when he talked about Hunt, I said, John, where does it all lead? I said, what's it going to cost? You can't just continue this way. He said, about $1 million. Unintelligible. I said, John, that's the point. Unintelligible. Unless I could get them up and say, look, fellas, it's too bad, and I give you executive clemency like tomorrow. What the hell do you think, Dean? President: I mean, you think the point is Hunt and the Cubans are not going to sit in jail for 4 years, and they are not being taken care of. Haldeman: That's the point. Now where are you going to get the money for that? President: That's the reason this whole thing falls apart. It's that astonishes me about Mitchell and the rest. Ehrlichman: Big problem. Material unrelated to presidential actions deleted here. President: The word never came up, but I said, I appreciate what you're doing. I knew it was for the purpose of helping the poor bastards through the trial, but you can't offer that, John. You can't. Or could you? I guess you could. Attorney's fees? Could you go a support program for these people for 4 years? Ehrlichman: I haven't any idea. I have no idea. Subsection 5. Consideration of clemency for Dean and Mitchell. Comments by the President at an April 14, 1973 meeting with Ehrlichman indicated he considered executive clemency for Dean and Mitchell in return for Dean's and Mitchell's cooperation in the Watergate affair. President: One point. You are going to talk to Dean? Ehrlichman: I am. President: What are you going to say to him? Ehrlichman: Well, to get off this passing the buck business. President: John, that's... Ehrlichman: It is a little touchy and I don't know how far I can go. President: John, that is not going to help you. Look, Dean, has to look down the road to one point. There is only one man who could restore him to the ability to practice law in case things go wrong. He's got to have that in the back of his mind. Ehrlichman: President: He's got to know that will happen. You don't tell him, but you know and I know that with him and Mitchell there isn't going to be any damn question because they got a bad rap. End of section 7. Section 8 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Dennison, Portland, Maine. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Section M. Activities relating to other investigations and court proceedings. White House and CRP officials were also concerned that other investigations besides the grand jury proceeding might uncover the true facts relating to the Watergate break-in. Subsection 1. The Patman Hearings. On August 19, 1972, Representative Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, ordered his committee staff to investigate the president's campaign finances, including the checks deposited in Barker's account. By early September, White House concern over the Patman Committee's investigation had mounted. Dean testified that from the beginning of this probe, the White House had two major fears. Quote, First, the hearings would have resulted in more adverse pre-election publicity regarding Watergate, and, second, they just might stumble into something that would start unraveling the cover-up, unquote. According to Dean, CRP counsel Parkinson was put in touch with Congressman Gary Brown, a committee member, to persuade Brown to help limit the scope of the committee's hearings. On September 8, Brown sent a letter to Attorney General Kleindienst, which, according to Dean, Parkinson had drafted. The letter inquired as to the propriety of Stan's testimony before the committee, scheduled for September 14, in view of pending civil and criminal suits. Congressman Brown has filed a sworn statement with the committee denying that Parkinson drafted this letter, and Dean's statement, admittedly based on hearsay, has not been corroborated. The committee has found no evidence that Congressman Brown committed any improprieties. The Justice Department, according to Dean, declined at this time such a suggestion to recommend that Stans not be required to testify, being of the view such a suggestion would appear part of a concerted effort to block the hearings. Nonetheless, Parkinson informed the committee that Stans would not appear in order to avoid prejudicing pending criminal investigations. In the last week of September, Dean took an active role in White House efforts to hinder the work of the Patman investigation. After Patman announced on September 25 that he would hold a vote on October 3 on issuing subpoenas to witnesses, Haldeman suggested that Dean talk to John Connally about blocking the committee's hearings. Connally, Dean said, responded that Patman's only, quote, soft spot, unquote, was a rumor that he had not reported large contributions from lobbyists. Dean then asked Parkinson to investigate the reports filed by members of the committee with the clerk of the House concerning campaign contributions. Parkinson furnished such a report on September 26, which Dean said he did not use. Dean next persuaded Henry Peterson, chief of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, to write committee members to dissuade them from issuing subpoenas. Peterson, in an October 2 letter to the members, asked that they delay their investigation because it might jeopardize fair criminal trials. On October 3, the committee voted not to hold hearings. However, on October 10, Patman announced that his committee would convene in 2 days in another attempt to investigate the Watergate affair. Patman requested Dean, Mitchell, McGregor, and Stans to appear. Dean declined to appear, claiming executive privilege. The others declined on advice of counsel, and Patman did not reconvene the committee. Subsection 2. The civil suits. A counteroffensive was likewise mounted regarding the civil suits brought by the Democratic National Committee against CRP. Dean testified that around September 9 or 10, both Haldeman and Colson relayed to him a request from the President that a counteraction be filed against the Democrats, quote, as quickly as humanly possible, unquote. On September 13, CRP filed a $2,500,000 countersuit against the DNC for abuse of process, and on September 14, Stans brought a $5 million libel suit against Lawrence O'Brien, DNC chairman. Dean testified that when he met with the President on September 15, the various civil cases were discussed. Dean stated he told the President that CRP lawyers were handling both the DNC suit and one filed by Common Cause. He said Judge Ritchie had been helpful in slowing down these civil cases. The President was informed as to the status of the CRP abuse of process suit and the Stans libel action. Haldeman's testimony and the edited transcripts support Dean's testimony in this regard. The edited transcripts at page 60 contain the following exchange. Dean: You might be interested in some of the allocations we got. The Stans libel action was assigned to Judge Ritchie. President: Expletive deleted. Dean: Well, now that is good and bad. Judge Ritchie is not known to be one of the inaudible on the bench. That is considered by me. He is fairly candid in dealing with people about the question. He has made several entrees off the bench, one to Kleindienst and one to Romer McPhee, to keep Romer abreast of what his thinking is. He told Romer he thought Murray ought to file a libel action. President: Did he? Haldeman: Can he deal with this concurrently with the court case? Dean: Yeah. The fact that the civil case drew to a halt, that the depositions were halted, he is freed. Haldeman: It was just off for a few days, wasn't it? Dean: It did more than that. He had been talking to Silbert, one of the assistant U.S. attorneys down here. Silbert said, We are going to have a hell of a time drawing these indictments because these civil depositions will be coming out and the grand jury has won out on this civil case, but it is nothing typical. Subsection 3. CIA investigative materials. According to Dean, shortly after the Select Committee was created, Ehrlichman urged him to have the CIA retrieve from the Department of Justice certain photographs which came from a CIA camera supplied Hunt that Hunt had returned to the agency. The pictures included one of Liddy posed in front of Dr. Fielding's office, which was burglarized. Dean said Ehrlichman wanted the photographs and accompanying documents retrieved, quote, before the Senate investigators got a copy of the material, unquote. Dean further testified he sought to obtain the photographs from Henry Peterson, claiming they had nothing to do with Watergate. Peterson told Dean that the Justice Department had received a letter from Senator Mansfield asking preservation of all evidentiary materials that might have any relationship to Watergate. Peterson stated he would be willing to return the materials to the CIA if it requested such action and leave a card in the department's file indicating what he had done. Subsequently, General Walters of the CIA visited Dean to state that he was opposed to retrieving the material under those circumstances, and the idea was dropped. Subsection 4. Other activities relating to the Select Committee. Evidence received by the Select Committee demonstrates considerable concern on the part of certain White House officials as to how to deal with the Select Committee, which, Dean said, was viewed as an uncontrollable, if not hostile, body that presented new and possibly more dangerous problems than the criminal trials. Item A. The La Costa meeting. A major meeting of White House officials to develop strategy regarding the Select Committee took place at the La Costa Resort Hotel, south of San Clemente, on February 10 and 11, 1973. Attending the meeting were Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, and Richard Moore. Dean stated that the meeting at La Costa was wide-ranging, involving an evaluation of Select Committee members and the White House strategy for dealing with the committee. According to Dean, the basic strategy was, the White House will take a public posture of full cooperation, but privately will attempt to restrain the investigation and make it as difficult as possible to get information and witnesses. A behind-the-scenes media effort would be made to make the Senate inquiry appear very partisan. The ultimate goal would be to discredit the hearings and reduce their impact by attempting to show that the Democrats have engaged in the same type of activities. Dean said a special program was planned to handle press coverage of the Senate hearings. Haldeman, he said, suggested that Pat Buchanan be used as a press watchdog. Buchanan would prepare speeches on biased press coverage, write op-ed articles, attend the hearings, and be the White House spokesman to take pressure off Ronald Ziegler in his daily briefings. Moore and Haldeman, however, recollect that it was Dean who suggested this role for Buchanan. Special plans were made as to CRP activities regarding the hearings. It was decided that CRP would increase its legal and public relations staff and that Paul O'Brien and Ken Parkinson would be responsible for handling CRP witnesses called to testify. Ehrlichman testified it was generally concluded that CRP, with Mitchell returning as its head, would operationally be the best entity to deal with the Select Committee hearings. Dean said that toward the end of the meeting on February 11, Ehrlichman raised the, quote, bottom line, unquote, question, quote, would the 7 Watergate defendants remain silent through the Senate hearings, unquote. This was important, Dean said, since their entire strategy rested on the continued silence of the Watergate defendants. Dean told Haldeman and Ehrlichman there were still demands for more money. Richard Moore, Dean said, was therefore assigned to go to New York to see Mitchell, quote, simply to lay it out that it was Mitchell's responsibility to raise the necessary funds for these men, unquote. Moore confirmed this testimony. Dean, in a sort of by-the-way reference, said he had been told by the lawyers, and I think that was the way he put it, but I cannot be precise about his language, that they may be needing some more money, and did we have any ideas? Someone said, isn't that something that John Mitchell might handle with his rich New York friends? It was suggested that since I would be meeting with Mr. Mitchell, I should mention this when I saw him, and I said I would. Ehrlichman also confirms that Moore was sent to New York to see Mitchell about raising money for the Watergate defendants whose sentences were pending. When Moore broached the issue with Mitchell, Mitchell said, according to Moore, quote, get lost, unquote, or, quote, tell them to get lost, unquote. Mitchell confirms that he declined Moore's fundraising suggestion. He testified that the, quote, general tenor of the subject matter was that the money was for the payment for the support and the legal fees of the people that were involved in the Watergate, unquote. Moore, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman provided further confirmation and elaboration of Dean's testimony concerning the La Costa discussion. Moore testified that at this meeting, the participants discussed preparation for the Select Committee hearings, executive privilege, a possible White House statement on Watergate in advance of the hearings, manpower for CRP to cope with the hearings, and the pending lawsuits. Ehrlichman testified that the La Costa meeting was called, quote, because the president had asked who was handling the preparation of the White House case for the Senate Select Committee hearings, and what planning was being done, and what was the White House position going to be on matters like executive privilege, and there were no answers to those questions, unquote. Ehrlichman admitted that the La Costa group discussed steps to effect the Select Committee's resolution and also evaluated members of the committee. He also confirmed that a strategy to block or delay the hearings was discussed, including a proposal to seek judicial delay. Haldeman basically concurred in Moore's recollections of the La Costa meeting. The interest of the White House in affecting the outcome of the Select Committee's hearings is further demonstrated by numerous passages in the edited presidential transcripts where the President, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Dean discussed various ways to deal with the upcoming hearings to limit the Select Committee's effectiveness and to, quote, cut the losses, unquote, of the White House. The meeting of February 28, 1973 between the President and Dean at pages 55 to 76, which is subsequently discussed. Part B. Documentary and other evidence indicating the White House strategy. In support of his testimony concerning White House preparations for the hearings, Dean submitted to the committee a February 9, 1973, quote, eyes only, unquote, memorandum from Haldeman to Dean, emphasizing the need for a minority counsel to the Irvin Committee, who was a, quote, real tiger, not an old man or a softhead, unquote. Also, Haldeman indicated therein that Dean would instruct Kleindienst to order the FBI to prepare a file on the, quote, 1968 bugging, unquote, of candidate Richard Nixon in preparation for a counteroffensive. Haldeman, under questioning, authenticated this memorandum. Another memorandum supplied by Dean was from Lawrence Higbee, Haldeman's assistant to Dean, dated February 10, 1973. This document emphasized the need, quote, to get a thorough itemization as quickly as possible of all the disruptions that occurred in the campaign for our Watergate tactics with the Irvin Committee, unquote. A demonstration of the strong counteroffensive Haldeman was planning is found in a memorandum from Haldeman to Dean dated February 10, 1973. We need to get our people to put out the story on the foreign or communist money that was used in support of demonstrations against the president in 1972. We should tie all 1972 demonstrations to McGovern and thus to the Democrats as part of the peace movement. The investigation should be brought to include the peace movement which leads directly to McGovern and Teddy Kennedy. This is a good counteroffensive to be developed. We need to develop the plan on to what extent the Democrats were responsible for the demonstrations that led to violence or disruption. There is also the question of whether we should let out the Fort Wayne story now, that we ran a clean campaign compared to theirs of libel and slander, such as against Rebozo, etc. We could let Evans and Novak put it out and then be asked about it to make the point that we knew and the president said it was not to be used under any circumstances. In any event, we have to play a very hard game on this whole thing and get our investigations going as a countermove. Haldeman accepted responsibility for the contents of this memorandum. Dean testified the White House feared the Senate hearing might force the Justice Department into further criminal investigations that would lead back to the White House. It was important, Dean said, that the president meet with Kleindienst and, quote, bring him back in the family to protect the White House, unquote. Dean indicated he felt the president should, quote, solicit Kleindienst's assistance during the hearings and, if anything should develop during the hearings, to not let all hell break loose in a subsequent investigation, unquote. The proposed meeting between the president and Kleindienst was to be a, quote, stroking session, unquote. In a February 22, 1973 talking paper, which Dean submitted to Haldeman for transmittal to the president, the following recommendations were made respecting this proposed meeting. Kleindienst should be asked to remain in office until at least 1 full year from this date, i.e., until after the Watergate hearings have passed, because the hearings may well result in a request for additional action by the Department of Justice. We can't afford bitterness at Justice, nor can we risk a new Attorney General being able to handle some of the potential problems. Kleindienst should be asked to follow the hearings closely and keep us appraised of any potential problems from a Department of Justice standpoint. Kleindienst should be given the feeling that he is an important member of the team, and it is not merely because of these hearings that he is being asked to stay on. Kleindienst confirmed that he met with President Nixon in late February and that the president requested him to stay at his post until the investigation was over. Several days later, on February 28, the president personally expressed to Dean his concern over the upcoming Select Committee hearings. The president stated his hope that the committee would have one, quote, big slam-bang thing for a whole week, unquote, after which, quote, interest in the whole thing will fall off, unquote. Dean warned the president that, I think this is going to be very different. It will be hot. I think they are going to be tough. I think they're going to be gory in some regards. But I'm also convinced that if everyone pulls their own oar in this thing, and all those we've got with various concerns, we can make it through these things and minimal people will be hurt. And they may even paint themselves as being such partisans. The president said he hoped the committee would, quote, be partisan rather than for them to have a facade of fairness and all the rest, unquote. The February 28 meeting concluded with President Nixon telling Dean that he expected Mitchell, quote, won't allow himself to be ruined by Watergate. He will put on his big stone face before the committee, but I hope he does, and he will, unquote. Dean expressed concern that the Select Committee was out to get him, a notion the president discounted. The president, however, did indicate a belief that the Select Committee was, quote, after, unquote, Haldeman, Colson, or Ehrlichman. Subsection 5. Henry Peterson's communications to the president. The edited transcripts of presidential conversations show that Henry Peterson, chief of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, served as a conduit for a constant flow of information from the grand jury, and the prosecutors first to Dean and then to the president. The transcripts also demonstrate that the president kept Haldeman and Ehrlichman informed of what he learned from Peterson. Peterson's conduct raises a serious question as to whether high Department of Justice officials can effectively administer criminal justice where White House personnel or the president himself are the subjects of the investigation. The conflict of interest is apparent, and a committee recommendation deals directly with this issue. Early in the Watergate investigation, in 1972, Peterson had kept Dean informed. Dean told the president during their morning March 21 meeting that Peterson had made him, quote, totally aware, unquote, of relevant information with respect to the prosecutorial effort. There is no doubt that I was totally aware of what the Bureau, FBI, was doing at all times. I was totally aware of what the grand jury was doing. I knew what witnesses were going to be called. I knew what they were asked, and I had to. The president asked Dean, quote, why did Peterson play the game so straight with us, unquote. Dean replied, because Peterson is a soldier. He kept me informed. He told me when we had problems, where we had problems, and the like. He believed in you, and he believes in this administration. This administration made him. I don't think he had done anything improper, but he did make sure that the investigation was narrowed down to the very, very fine criminal thing, which was a break for us. There is no doubt about it. Dean assured the president during this meeting that Peterson is, quote, the only man I know that really could tell us how this could be put together so that it did the maximum to carve it away with a minimum of damage to individuals involved, unquote. Later, in April 1972, Peterson and the president met on several occasions to discuss the progress of the Watergate investigation. At one session, Peterson assured the president that the investigation would not reach him because the Department of Justice had no jurisdiction to investigate the president. I've said to U.S. Attorney Harold H. Titus, quote, we have to draw the line. We have no mandate to investigate the president. We investigate Watergate, unquote. He continued, My understanding of law is, my understanding of our responsibilities is that if it came to that, I would have to come to you and say, we can't do that. The only people who have jurisdiction to do that is the House of Representatives, as far as I'm concerned. Peterson, however, at an April 17 meeting told the president that, Mr. President, if I thought you were trying to protect somebody, I would have walked out. Peterson's role as a conduit of secret grand jury information is illustrated by his telephone conversation of April 16, 1973, with the president from 8:58 p.m. to 9:14 p.m. The conversation began, President, I just want to know if there are any developments I should know about, and, second, that, of course, as you know, anything you tell me, as I think I told you earlier, will not be passed on. Henry Peterson, I understand, Mr. President. President, because I know the rules of the grand jury. Peterson then began to relate to the president secret information before the grand jury. He relayed to the president the factual details of the investigation, even indicating where there were gaps. Thus, he told the president that Dean, quote, got in touch with Kalmbach to arrange for money, the details of which we really don't know as yet. The next morning, April 17, from 9:47 to 9:59 a.m., the president met with Haldeman and discussed strategy for dealing with the Watergate affair. In the course of that conversation, the president, who had been informed that the Justice Department did not know the details of Kalmbach's arrangement for money, said to Haldeman, another thing, if you could get John Ehrlichman and yourself to sit down and do some hard thinking about what kind of strategy you're going to have with the money, you know what I mean. The president also told Haldeman, well, be sure that Kalmbach is at least aware of this, that LaRue has talked very freely. He is a broken man. Peterson had informed the president on April 16, 1973, that Dean had said that Liddy, quote, confessed to Dean, unquote, on June 19, 1972, and that Dean then told Ehrlichman what Liddy had said. The next morning, the president told Haldeman, Dean met with Liddy on June 19th. Must have been when he did it. He was in California in January, but that's irrelevant. But they keep banging around and banging around. The prosecution gets out the damn stuff. Did John talk with you about it? Haldeman, yeah, he mentioned it. Dean did tell us that story in Ehrlichman's office last week or 2 weeks ago. President, but not to go all through this. Haldeman, I don't think so. The transcript of the President-Peterson meeting of April 17 provides another example of Peterson's briefing the president on information received by the prosecutors and grand jury. This conversation also shows that Peterson was giving the president tactical advice as to the posture the White House should strike during the investigation. During this conversation, the president told Peterson not to tell him, quote, anything out of the grand jury unless you think I need to know it. If it corroborates something or anybody here, I need to know it. Otherwise, I don't want to know about it, unquote. The president then asked, quote, I guess it would be legal for me to know, unquote, and Peterson responded, quote, well, yes, I think it is legal for you to know, unquote. Peterson subsequently left this meeting. Haldeman and Ehrlichman appeared, and the president proceeded then to relay to them the information obtained from Peterson. At least by April 27, Peterson's constant contact with the White House created suspicions among the Department of Justice Watergate investigators. Peterson admitted to the president on April 27, we had a kind of crisis of confidence night before last, and, in effect, it concerned me, whether or not they were at ease with my reporting to you, and I pointed out to them that I had very specific instructions, discussed that with them before on that subject. As a consequence, I kind of laid into Harold Titus yesterday, and it cleared the air a little bit, but there is a very suspicious atmosphere. They are concerned and scared. End of Section 8.